Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Financial Assistance Program Committee meeting for Monday, November 24th, 2025. I'll call this meeting to order at 10:02 a.m. Item number 2 on our agenda is a declaration of pecuniary interest. If anybody has one during the course of the conversation, we know that we have to acknowledge that. Item number 3 is approval of the agenda. Can I get a mover and a seconder to approve the agenda as circulated? Moved by member Boer, seconded by member Wickens. Any questions or comments on the agenda? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That is carried. Moving on to item number 4 is approval of the minutes. 4.1, that the Financial Assistance Program Committee approves the minutes of 2025-05-12 as circulated. Can I get a mover and a seconder for that? Moved by member Allwood, seconded by member Wickens. Any questions or comments on the minutes from May 12th? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That is carried. Now the reason we are here, item number 5.1, Community Grant Program Guidelines for Review. So we are here to have a discussion on this. Do we have a staff person to make any presentation first? Director MacArthur.
Thanks. Just a quick comment, I guess, at this point, and just in talking with Danielle and with the finance director, that we're not necessarily in a position to make changes to this in light of this year being a mayor's budget and to see what he presents. So I think is one thing that we could potentially discuss is changing the timeline that applications are received. That would be under the authority of this committee. I think last year or the previous years, it's been kind of an open intake from January to March, which does make it challenging for groups, that are looking for approval of dollars before that. Might be a challenging year, the way the budget unfolds. So just that is one thing I think that this group could consider, is maybe closing or leaving a 4-week intake window versus, to the end of March, to help staff facilitate that process, and this group to review all those applications and get that in advance of budget kind of being finalized. So hopefully that helps.
Right. I was going to ask for Deputy Clerk Thompson to come on and maybe provide clarity on terms of direction that we can give from this meeting.
Thank you. Through you, Chair Nielsen. My suggestion would be, if there are recommended changes, including changes to the intakes and the timelines for the intake being open to receive applications, that needs to be direction from council. So unfortunately, this committee does not have the delegated authority to make changes to the guidelines, including the timelines for applications. So my suggestion would be that if there are items that the members feel there need to be changes to those guidelines, including the timelines, then that needs to be brought forward as a notice of motion from a council member.
So a question for you, Deputy Clerk Thompson. Council directed, I think the motion from council was to direct this committee to review the guidelines. I understand the terms of reference don't give authority, and I think that's the question mark here. But council has directed the group to do it. So I'm a little confused as to how come, if council's direction was for this group to review and make recommendations, that we can't. I understand the terms of reference say that, but we've been given direction by council.
Thank you. Through you, Chair Nielsen. I had the same question as to why the direction would be provided or recommended to review. My thought is that this should simply be an overview of what's included in those guidelines. But ultimately, it's at the chair's discretion how they wish to proceed.
Fair. I think perhaps then the conversation that can come out from this, having 3 council members as part of this subcommittee, is any conversation we do have here, while maybe the group itself can't make a recommendation to council, the council members that are here can take the discussion from here and move it along a council chain if there are changes that want to be suggested or made to the guidelines. I think this conversation kind of stemmed from conversations we had at the council table post budget, where certain community groups, we had already approved, and community groups were getting access to free rentals or financial support before the whole budget itself had been approved and adopted. So does any member have any questions or comments around the level of discussion we're going to partake today? I'm not seeing any questions that way. Oh, Councilor Member Elwood.
Thank you, Chair Nielsen. Yeah, I was talking with Coordinator Deputy Clerk Thompson just before you guys all arrived. I think the direction from council fell out of the meeting that we had with the Kimberley Community Association and their requests. And as I recall, there was some discussion about the intake dates discussed, and maybe that was the direction, one of the directions that council was looking for this committee to review.
Mm-hmm.
Coordinator Del Duca, I think, spoke to that at that meeting, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, because we were discussing how a group was able to go above and beyond the limitations that are set out in the guidelines.
That's right.
So, Coordinator Del Duca, did you have something, you popped on there for a second? Did you have something you wanted to add to that? Like just as a recollection of to how maybe we got this committee together here today? Oh, you're on mute, sir.
Through you, Chair. Sorry. To the committee. Yes, so last year's intake was from January to March. As Director MacArthur said, it posed some challenges for the groups looking for rentals. And I mean, by the time the committee met, you already had 3 or 4 months of rentals taking place. So yeah, you can't very well deny them at that point. However, yeah, if we the main reason I was hoping for a meeting was for the committee to maybe ask council to change the intake date to end at the end of January at the latest. It would be my preference, just or logistically, and for the groups to have some time as well, just so that there's not a big stretch of time where bookings were approved retroactively.
Right. So that if I'm hearing you correctly, you're suggesting that we begin the intakes after January or end the intakes at the end of January?
Yeah, I would say this at the end of December, just to keep in the calendar year, and so that requests are made prior to the new year. And however, I don't think I'm not sure if that would work due to the holiday schedule and everything, and
Right.
For council or the FAP to meet again before then.
Right. Thank you for that, Coordinator Duca. Member Boer, I saw your hand raised.
Yes, I just had a comment. I agree with Coordinator Del Duca that the intake for venues, for rentals, etc., perhaps could be more timely. And he's right. We already had 3 months of rentals or venues used during 2025. But for some groups that are, I'm going to say, a little less active during the winter months, they may not have the wherewithal to have made plans for what their 2026 events might be. So could I suggest maybe a couple of intake dates, one for venues and another for events that will be happening during the spring and summer and fall months of 2026. And I don't know how that would work, but like I understand the venue need. But I am also cognizant of the fact that some groups even don't meet during the winter months because they don't have any activities planned or upcoming until the following year, and then they don't meet till like early spring.
Right.
So thank you.
Thanks for that, Member Boer. I'm wondering, just to staff, we have an intake date as a way to make the process fair and equitable to every community group so that there's no front of the line, I guess is the best way to put it. I know we have our significant community events. They're in our calendar, and I think they're repeated annually without much work from the community groups. But if there's community group events that are annual, is it worth a conversation to see if the committee is supportive of repetitive requests coming in, like at the time of the event, say 2025 for the 2026 dates, and then it's kind of like earmarked on a calendar. Coordinator Del Duca, is that something that would make things easier for staff to be able to kind of build the calendar out as soon as possible? To a member board's comments about when groups meet, if they're not meeting in the winter because they're doing everything in the spring or something like that.
Through you, Chair. Yeah, absolutely. That's something we can look at. That would, as you mentioned, we do have a number of SCUs, significant community undertakings, and when we do notice, when we do notice that there's a repetition for those, we do recommend to the FAP that they be considered an SCU. However, absolutely, if it's the wish of the committee, I'm happy to facilitate that.
Member Wickens, I see you want to speak. You're already unmuted. Nope, you just muted yourself now. There you go.
Yeah, I kind of thought that this meeting was about discussing the new anyways, and make recommendations, and so I don't have any problems with the way that the new community grant system is set up. But, I just I don't understand why we can't make recommendations.
Yeah, I guess it's just a little bit of a procedural conundrum there, Member Wickens, where within the terms of reference of this group, we don't have authority to change the guidelines.
Right.
But then there was this kind of conundrum where council gave direction for this group to talk about the guidelines. And so we're in a little bit of a purgatory. However, I think what we should be able to do, because this committee does function in a way to review applications and review intakes, there's nothing wrong with us having a conversation around the intake dates. Just this committee today won't make a formal recommendation to council. However, from this conversation, if one of the 3 members of council wishes to make a notice of motion or anything along those lines to make some changes at the council table, that is kind of what this would be, rather than an automatic feed up of a motion coming from this table. Once we get to the council table, we'd have to make a notice of motion to move any changes along.
Yeah.
Gotta love procedural bylaws. Member Allwood. You're on mute, sir.
Yep.
we
In the body of the guidelines, it mentions that facility contracts must be completed and signed no less than 60 days prior to the date of the event or funding support. So again, that creates issues for January the 1st. If I understand what we're trying to do here, but that needs to be addressed also, I guess.
I think in the past, there was a conversation of an earlier iteration trying to have the intake dates carry over to March of the next year because of the budget cycle. And I guess that itself has changed, Coordinator Del Duca, that we only are looking at the calendar year because then you can't confirm there's budget for it. It's like a weird conundrum because of the budget process and the timing of budget.
Yeah, through you, Chair, if I may. Excuse me. Yes, that was our original hope, but as you mentioned, it does get a little bit complicated with the budget cycle, or with the budget being the way it is. there are some other recommended changes we'll bring forward to the committee as well regarding the guidelines and criteria, but the intake date is the biggest priority right now.
Right. So I guess staff are working on a report for council on some other updates or changes to the system, but the main point for discussion today is seeing where this committee feels around the intake date, and then what discussion can we have up at the council table around that. I don't know if this is a question for Coordinator Del Duca or perhaps Director MacArthur, just in understanding the budget cycle. Are we able to give direction in a budget that sets out carryover dollars? Like, I know some projects say you put in $75,000 for a project, but the project doesn't get finished in 2025 for the 2025 budget, the money's carry over. Are we able to do something similar to that for this program? Is that even a possibility? Staff are pondering that one. We got Cornell Duduka is going to try and field that question.
Through you, Chair. Manager
Krause is coming to back him up.
I will let
I'll
Manager
back you up,
Krause.
Rob.
I'll let Manager Krause take this one. I didn't have an answer for you. Sorry, Chair.
And that's fair. Like, we don't have our treasurer with us. That's a fair comment from Cornell Duduka. Manager Krause, you're going to try and field that one.
I'll try to fill this one through you,
Sure.
Chair. Typically in the past, I'm not 100% sure here. I would have to get the finance to verify it or confirm it. But typically, yes, you can defer monies from one year to the next.
So then if we tried to set up some kind of an intake date, you could specify, like, that was the challenge, right? Can we specify that the monies go carry over to the next year to facilitate the first couple of months? And then if budget changes, and then the intake date would be after that. Because the reason I bring that up is, like, around this intake, if we have the intake date as the end of December, which is currently difficult to facilitate because we'd be giving community groups 5 weeks to have their meeting, make their planning schedules and dates, and then get back to us. It makes it challenging when we don't know what the budget's going to say. Residents come forward with requests, then the budget changes, and then we have to go back to the residents anyways. So to the committee around intake dates, staff are hoping for, I don't want to say a tighter window, but a window that would end the end of January. Where does, I remember, Board, you've made comment that you don't see a problem with that one, other than your idea of making sure that there's possibly a secondary intake later on for community groups. Do Member Allwood or Member Wickens have any other comments around that idea of, like, ending the community intake dates for the end of January? Member Wickens? Then we'll go member.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with that as long as it doesn't interfere with scheduling dates. You know, like Rob was talking about the retroactive. So, you know.
Member Allwood?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Coordinator Del Duca wanted to comment on Councilor Wickens before I spoke.
If you have any comments, then we can let Member or Coordinator Del Duca speak to both of you at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm almost thinking that we, you know, for as Member or mentioned, you know, for booking space, why we couldn't have the intake end in the prior calendar, you know, the end of December of the prior year, so that we know it would help with coordinating scheduling. And you know, I know some of the groups don't meet in the wintertime, but a lot of these groups programs are, you know, are annual programs. They continue every year. You know, speaking like the rec committee has Brew Bash and some other, that I think that's a significant community event, but it's probably not a good example. But they do tend to put their plans together well in advance of the coming year.
Yes. Coordinator Del Duca.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And through you. Yes, I'll be frank. It would be my hope in the future, moving forward, that the intake deadline would be prior to the end of November next year, so that there is time to gather the submissions, create an agenda, and have the FAP review it prior to the end of the year. That is my hope. Again, I'll be frank. There was some issues last year with staffing and whatnot, so that is a reason why the intake was pushed back a bit. However, yes, it would be my preference that, as Councillor or Member Allwood said, to have the intake deadline be let's say mid-November or in that area, so that we have time to bring an agenda back to the FAP committee prior to the end of the year. And as with the guidelines and criteria, I'll bring a report back this year, early next year, sorry. And then we could recommend those changes as well to the committee, along with some other changes in the guidelines and criteria. If that makes sense.
I understand that one. A question for you is there any logic around having two intake dates, but the intake is only for a specified period of the year? So say we had an intake of like November, but that was for January to June, and then we had an intake in March for July through December. And then that way you would be able to have community groups have their meeting and have their timeline, and for staff purposes, we're planning out so many months. It would the question mark there is, I guess, council sets a budget, and the budget would have a finite number, so then you're front loading anybody who is doing a project from January to June might have access to more dollars than somebody doing from July to December. I'll go Coordinator Del Duca just for thought on that, and then Member Wickens. And Manager
Thank you,
Krause,
Chair.
too.
Thank you, Chair, through you. Yeah, we used to have, I think it was 4 intakes before the predecessor changed we changed the program. I'm not adverse to the idea about going to 2 intakes. Again, my only concern would be the one you raised about loading the early bookings up and not having much left for the second half of the year. However, I'm sure there's ways to get around that.
Manager Krause, did you have a comment on that? Then I'll go Member Wickens.
No, actually, the only comment I would have is I think that would be a good idea to have 2 intakes. Again, just if this is a new process and new program for me, but so how does it typically work? So if you did have 2 intakes, would the money be split 50-50 for the first intake and the second intake, or would that be hard because the events are very different in needs and stuff like that?
I think that's the hard part. So we do have the significant community undertakings, which we know requires X. So from the budget, those ones get allocated right off the hop. So that if say your total budget allocation is 20,000 and the significant community intakes take 15, well, then there's 5,000 left. That's not the real numbers, but that's like an example. And then that money left over is what it can be utilized throughout the rest of the year for any other requests. And I think and then from there, you could specify a certain amount of dollars but that'd be kind of a different question. If I go too far down this train of thought, Deputy Clerk might come in and chastise me for not staying on topic. But I think there is question marks as to how that financially plays out. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Member Wickens, sorry thanks for your patience. Your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, as Rob said, like the weight of the bulk of the funds would get taken up in the first intake if we do 2, but if we, we do the community, the events that get done every year and then split the funds up 50-50 between January and June. So I don't know if that makes it too busy or.
Coordinator Del Duca?
Thank you, Chair. To reflect on Councillor Wickens' comments. Previously, when we had more than one intake, groups we have a good list of a group of groups that know the program. And when they previously they would submit for their whole year in the first intake. And so then the second intake or the third intake were generally other things that came about from other groups. There wasn't often times where the same group would apply multiple times throughout the year.
Right.
So if you were to do 2 intakes, it might be a little bit easier not to limit just to the first half of the year. However, if there is remaining funds in the community grant program budget, then we could open up a second one.
I gotcha. Yeah, because you're letting resident groups be more organized, or my thought might have been more restrictive to the community groups being as organized as they can be. Member Wickens?
Yeah, there's that to be said about it as well. It's, I guess if you're going to be a community group, you need to have some idea what you're going to be doing in the next year.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Irony being
it's
that's what we're
very
trying to do. How does
hey,
council plan out a whole year?
it's very yeah. Well, as we've all learned, you can't please everyone. So yeah, I guess if that's I shouldn't say the easiest, but probably the best. I guess do one intake, and if you miss out, you'll have to sharpen your pencil for next year.
There you go.
Yeah.
Member Bohr?
Thank you, Chair Nielsen. I do agree with the comments that have been made about the early intake in order to get the scheduling correct for all the groups. I'm just looking at the item 6.5. It says our 2025 budget still has almost $20,000 unused in it. So if that could be like a contingency fund, I'm going to say, for in 2026, if there was still funds left over after the first intake of all the groups for the entire year was factored in. If, and it's a big if there was still budget left in our community grant program budget, that at that point we could open for a secondary intake. But that's not necessarily a given if all the funds are used up in the first grants that are allowed for the entire year. And I agree, most groups do know, like I think Mr. Allwood mentioned the Boo Bash, like they do know kind of what their events have been annually. But it's kind of nice to have a little bit of a cushion if somebody comes up with a brand new idea to say, oh, well, let's try this. I'd like to still stay open to that possibility, but you're right. Most of the groups will know what their expenses and their venue needs, et cetera, are for the entire year. So they could apply for those in late November, as Coordinator Del Duca had suggested, and then that would be given for the next year. Thank you.
Fair point, Member Bohr. As a group today, we're not going to make any recommendations on this to council, but we are listening intently, Member Wickens, Allwood, and myself. I think the challenge here is that there are a few different ideas, but it's how do we reconcile the budget cycle with the community group needs in terms of deadlines. Coordinator Del Duca, your thoughts on future intakes for like 2026 if your magic wand existed and you could create the process. You were saying have a meeting and approvals prior to budget so that council would have an honest request view. I guess my only thought there, I do like that one because then it gives council the better picture where the right amount of money can be allocated rather than having funds allocated that then aren't used. But if council limits the budget, then we've already approved certain ones, we have to go back. So it does create a little bit of a conundrum there, but most likely council wouldn't. It's already approved them because council at the end of the day has to approve the final recommendations from this committee, right? Sorry, Cornelio Duduca. I'm thinking this one through in my head as I'm talking. Okay. Any other thoughts on potential intake scenarios? Currently, the consensus I'm hearing is that trying to facilitate one intake earlier in 2026 with a deadline of maybe end of January makes sense to this committee as a whole. It seems to be the consensus here. And then if there's funds left over, have a secondary intake later in 2026 for any thoughts that come up. And then work towards having the intake be prior to November 2026, but staff will come forward with a report in 2026 so that the full discussion can happen with this committee prior to budget 2027, the 2027 budget, sorry. Am I clear as mud to everybody? Any other thoughts on that? Manager Kraus?
No, I'm okay. Sorry. Thank
Okay,
you.
no worries. Member Bohr. Member Allwood's thinking about a question.
I just had a question about the budget that's still remaining for 2025. Does that roll forward into 2026 to make an additional, I'm going to say almost $20,000, $19,445? Does that roll forward into the 2026 community grant program cash, or is that wiped away with the new budget and then we start fresh with a new budget figure for 2026? Sorry. Thank
Nope,
you.
great question, Member Bohr. I'll look to my finance liaison, Member Allwood. Might have a thought on that one. I have my own thought, but I'll hear what the finance liaison has to say.
Yeah, I mean, typically that money is in a reserve and unless it's allocated, it wouldn't be wiped out. There may be some discussion during this coming budget deliberations about the amount of money in the program, but overall, but it wouldn't affect the reserve at this point. Typically, these programs are set up where, the funds are allocated. They're basically in a reserve and then allocated from the reserve to projects as this committee approves them or recommends them to council for approval. So that money should still be there unless council as a whole decides to allocate it somewhere else, which is possible, I guess, but unlikely, in my opinion. The question I had, though, to your earlier comment, Chair Nielsen, was if we're going to change or recommend, we can't even recommend the change to this committee, but if we're going to change the intake period for 2026 from March 31st, when's that going to happen and how's the public going to know about that? Doesn't give them a lot of time, and as Member Bohr mentioned, some of these organizations don't meet
Right.
Between now and maybe sometime into the new year. Thank you.
Cornelio Duduca popped up. I have two thoughts on that. One is a notice of motion that gets presented the next council meeting, or two, Cornelio Duduca, is there opportunity for staff to bring forward a report following this discussion? Because that might be, Cornelio Duduca. That might be a question for Deputy Clerk too.
Through you, Chair. To Member Elwood's comment, I have a good relationship with the groups. It would be no problem from my from staff's end to reach out to the groups to communicate these changes. or the deadline changes. I'm comfortable with that. And as you mentioned before, or one of the other members mentioned before, is that generally the groups know prior to the new year what there's or very early in the new year what their schedules are going to be like for that year. I think Member Wickens mentioned that. So I think I'm comfortable with being able to communicate that.
Thanks, Coordinator Duca. A question for Deputy Clerk Thompson. We're having general conversations, staying within our rules and regulations for today. But some of this is like staff or already planning a report to come forward on recommendations for this program. The committee can't direct staff, but staff already have the thoughts. So procedurally, it would be faster for a staff report to appear on the next council meeting than for a council member to make a notice of motion. From your perspective as the deputy clerk, is that something that staff can take away from this, or would there need to be the direction from the council to make that staff doing that?
Thank you, Chair Nielsen, through you. I do think that we're kind of
Walking the line.
walking the line, even simply with having the debate of the decided matter of council, which is the community grant program guideline. My suggestion would be perhaps that a member of the committee, a council member of the committee, bring forward like a direct notice of motion at the next council meeting, just to avoid, as you say, the committee cannot
Direct staff.
So I think my suggestion for the best path forward would be that notice of motion.
Right.
And perhaps that notice of motion could also include direction for staff to bring back a report for amendments to the intake for the 2027 year.
Okay. Any other thoughts from the committee? Member Alwood?
Just so I'm clear, so the notice of motion would modify the intake dates for the 2026 year and recommend the change for the 2027 year, right?
I think a notice
understand
of motion just needs to really affect the 2026 intake date.
Yeah.
And then sounds like staff are working on a report to review the whole process. That should come forward sometime in the early next year. But this is more just, can we have a notice of motion that would help to define the next intake? And then the following intake will be presented in the staff report.
Okay, thank you.
Member Wickens?
Yeah, I wonder if we could even maybe make this time sensitive as well, and I don't know.
That's a conversation for the clerk.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah. Because yeah, make it time sensitive when we get it on the agenda with the two-thirds majority, and anyways. All right.
So what I'll do is just one last time, is there anybody else who has a comment on the intake process? And if there really isn't one, then I'll look for a motion that the Financial Assistance Program Committee receive the Community Grant Program Guideline Review for information. So I don't see a new thought. Does somebody wish to move the motion that's on the agenda for 5.1? Member Board? Can I get a seconder? This is just because we're having the discussion. So seconded by Member Wickens. And then is there any last final thoughts on this? I mean, we can sit here and talk for 20 more minutes and go around in circles, but if we have a general idea about the next steps, then perhaps we'll move forward. So seeing no further questions or comments, I'll call the question. All those in favor? That is carried. Item 6 on our agenda is the next meeting, which is to be determined following the intake. So hopefully spring of 2026, we can have a committee meeting and have a review of that. And so there's just one final item on the agenda for today to adjourn. Would somebody like to move to adjourn? Member Allwood, seconded by Member Wickens. And that we are adjourned at 10:42 a.m. with a plan to move forward. All those in favor? Carried. Manager Kraus just want to pop on to say goodbye. Unless you have a thought, Manager Kraus?
I did. I just wanted to say have a good afternoon.
That's a great thought after the adjournment, because otherwise Deputy Clerk might get mad at me. We've already adjourned. Have a wonderful day, everybody. I'm sure we'll have fantastic time and discussions about this in the future. Thank you for attending today, Member Board.